We grew up in Washington Heights, which, as many of you know, was populated then by Eastern European Jewish immigrants and recent German Jewish immigrants who had escaped Hitler, including, most famous of all, of course, Henry Kissinger, whose parents moved to Washington Heights. They used to humorously, the German Jewish immigrants used to call it humorously the Fourth Reich. Now, I went to public school 173 in Manhattan. And it's amazing. Here's one school, one little element. You look through the list of graduates of that little elementary school in the 1940s, and it includes a list of people who turned out to be some of the most distinguished figures in their field: theater, journalism, culture, art. Really amazing. And we were all in that school together. And in that school, in that time, the New York City school system in those days, the teaching staff was largely, well, first all women, but largely Irish Catholic. And here, the student body in PS 173 was largely Jewish immigrant, kids of immigrants from Eastern Europe or Germany, and almost all of them socialists or communists. And this was a mix that caused for great problems. So, to put it very simply, it was a very politicized environment. I'll give you just two brief examples. One of my classmates was a young friend of mine named Jake Rosen, who later on, many years later, gained notoriety with a full-page picture in Life magazine dipping the American flag to Nikita Khrushchev as he passed him at the Moscow Youth Festival in the 1950s. And he later became one of the founding members of the Maoist group, the Progressive Labor Party. But we were in 1st through 6th grade together. And in those days, we had, not what we have now, African History Month, we had Negro History Week. Remember, African Americans were called Negroes then. Negro History Week. And we were asked, the textbooks were really backwards then. All the textbooks had about Negro Americans were Booker T. Washington and a little section of slavery, which essentially said the slaves were happy. And I remember that. But we had Negro History Week, and of course the Communist Party was very active in the pre-civil rights era in that issue. And in Negro History Week, we were asked to bring in something. Each student was supposed to say something or bring in something that would show the contribution of Negro Americans to the society. So little Jake Rosen, we were in the 6th grade then, brought in a record to play. And he put it on, and the teacher, Mrs. Agnes Driscoll, that's actually her name, because I referred back to the old news reports about this incident. It got into the newspapers. Mrs. Driscoll said, "Oh, that's wonderful. What a wonderful voice. Who is that?" And of course, Jake Rosen said, "That's Paul Robeson." At that point, Mrs. Driscoll hit the ceiling, sent Jake Rosen to the principal's office. He was then suspended from school and sent home for bringing in this record of a communist. At that point, the PTA pulled us all out and said no students could go back unless this was settled, unless Jake Rosen was let back in. It became a big incident. It was written up in all the New York City papers. So we had a politicized environment. The other time, those of us who were good in school, who were good students, got an award, a citizenship award, from the Daughters of the American Revolution. Now, you remember this was when the DAR was not letting Marian Anderson sing in Washington, D.C., and Eleanor Roosevelt arranged that big concert at the Lincoln Memorial. So we got this DAR award, and we were little kids. We were very happy. We brought some medal home. And I remember our parents said, "Oh, how nice, you got a prize." I said, "Just for citizenship." It said on the medal, Daughters of the American Revolution. Of course, our parents' jaws dropped. We were then told to go back and hand these medals back because we would not accept any medals from the DAR. And of course, we didn't understand this. We were very hurt. We had to give back a prize we had won. And this caused the whole thing, meetings, a PTA meeting. Again, this got into the newspapers. So, and there were other incidents, but this was elementary school. So, we started out with that. Now, what you have to realize, in a basic sense, the communist movement really is like a religion or a culture. It's not only a religion with its own saints and then, of course, its own heretics and its own doctrines that the catechisms you have to memorize, Marxism, Leninism, the dialectic, all the things that supposedly made it a science that you learned about later. But to institutionalize it, there's a separate cultural world. And this becomes the world of your friends and of your parents and of your families. And it begins, first of all, at a young period in one's life, with the summer camps. And there were a network of summer camps. Now, summer camps among Jews were, the New York Jewish Museum actually had an exhibit about Jewish summer camping. And there were many Jewish summer camps, secular camps, religious camps, workmen's circle camps, Jewish Federation of Philanthropies camps. They weren't all political, but the communist and socialist movements both had their networks of summer camps for the kids. And in fact, there were two Jewish summer camps for kids that were on opposite ends of the same lake. The Workmen's Circle Social Democrats had Camp Kindering, and the Communists had Camp Kinderland. They were on opposite sides of the lake, and the students, what they used to do, the campers used to take boats, and they would have vicious raids on each other, where they'd try and sink the boats when they were out rowing and so forth. It was a very testy situation to have Social Democrats at the other end of the lake. Now, there were three main camps. I went to Camp Woodland for children, that I will talk about. There was the Jewish communist camp, Camp Kinderland, that combined left-wing pro-Sovietism with working-class Jewish secular culture. And there was the camp that was really the most hardline of all, Camp Wochika. Now, Wochika, of course, sounds to the innocent like an American Indian name, but it stands for Workers' Children's Camp. And its theater, as you would guess, I'm sure, was called the Paul Robeson Playhouse. And Wochika was extremely politicized. This was the hard-handed, really set up directly by the Communist Party, and it was very dogmatic and sectarian. The kids at that camp could not read comic books, for example. They were ordered to turn them in and had to write about the racist and reactionary themes in the comic books. Particularly offensive, someone like Captain America, which extolled America as a noble nation fighting a good fight. You couldn't let kids read stuff like that. So they were ordered, actually, a very famous incident, to bring all their comics in and surrender them. And in their yearbook, they had a whole thing about how, at Wochika, we know comics are evil and we hand them in. Woodland was much looser. Woodland really epitomized the culture of what we call the Popular Front of the mid-1930s and then of the World War II years. It was really set up, not formally by the Communist Party, although all the leaders and founders and directors of Camp Woodland for Children were communists, as were many, if not all, of the counselors. But Woodland wasn't sectarian in the way Wochika or Kinderland was. Woodland emphasized racial harmony. It had scholarships for black kids from Harlem. It was even, ironically, featured in a big propaganda broadcast by the Voice of America in the 1950s as an example of how institutions in America preach and practice democracy. It was a great laugh, the Voice of America picking a really camp set up by communists to extol democracy in America. And Woodland also put the emphasis on what the folklorist Alan Lomax was doing on the national level. It oriented itself towards discovering the folk culture of the people of the Catskill Mountains. And there was an authentic indigenous culture of old folk songs by old-timers who were in their 80s and 90s, who grew up in the late turn of the century and had authentic traditional songs about their life in the mountains when they were working in the lumber mills and so forth. But what they tried to do was extol this really, truly existing indigenous local folk culture into a prototype of that is how, what we learned essentially is that's where the new socialist man was going to come out of, through the capturing and learning about this folk culture. And their big event was the Folk Festival of the Catskills. But they also had, as all summer camps had, most summer camps had what they called Olympics. And they would set up a red team and a blue team, and they would fight each other and have color wars and so forth. Well, our camp, Woodland, did not call it the Olympics. They did not call it color war, because that, of course, was really bourgeois. They called it the Summer Youth Festival, named after the World Youth Festival that the Soviet Union would sponsor and its front groups would sponsor each summer in all the communist nations after World War II. And the two most popular teams that everyone wanted to be part of in Woodland was either the People's Republic of China or the Soviet Union. Nobody wanted to be in the United States. And everybody would vie and cheer, especially for everyone else called it Red China. We called it the People's Republic of China. And one incident just from Woodland. Every camp, if you've ever gone to summer camp, you know there's obligatory rest period at the end of camp. And at the end of the lunch, you rest for an hour, calm down, take a breather, read, take a nap, whatever. Well, during the festival week, we really politically committed campers were given a great opportunity. We were told by our counselor that we had two young men who had come to speak to the camp. They were from Greece. And they had a special message for those of us who were politically advanced to meet with them. We could get out of rest period if we meet with them. So, of course, we agreed readily. It was a special privilege to be allowed to miss rest period. And we sat down in the lawn in the beautiful Catskill Mountains and heard an hour talk about the need to join the international communist movement, to be recruited into the young communist movement directly. They told us about the Greek Civil War and told us about the heroic effort of the Soviet Union to create a free Greece and the struggle against British imperialism and American imperialism, and tried to sign us up then and there to join officially the Communist Party youth movement. Well, at least I got out of rest period. But I was not quite ready to join then. I was very wary. But I had given these two young men my name, and lo and behold, when I got back at the end of camp, one day they appeared at my door in our New York apartment coming to see me. They were not going to let up, really going to recruit me. They were serious revolutionaries. So that took place too in the camp, because as I said, all the counselors were essentially communists or from that orbit, and we learned that. It was part of the same movement. It was below the surface in Woodland, but it was still there. So, you know, there's a historian who's written a book, a young left-wing historian who's written a book about these camps, and he used the term, he said what they were trying to do is create socialism in one summer, which was really a good way of putting it. This was to inculcate us, and you know, it's very romantic, sitting there and feeling that you have a whole great new world to build with a new kind of culture, a world of peace and harmony where everyone got along, where you destroy private property, where you have the socialist future. And, of course, the highlight was Pete Seeger coming to camp. Sometimes we say a week or two at a time. And I have, again, another romantic moment I remember vividly as if it was yesterday, where some of us went on an overnight with Pete Seeger, climbing to a mountaintop, and we sang all night long, and then he actually woke us up in the morning, cooking breakfast for us, singing Wake Up Jacob, Peas in the Pot and the Hoe Cakes Baking, sitting in a mountaintop in the Catskills with Pete Seeger making breakfast for you, singing folk songs. I mean, this was a romantic thing which sticks with you. It's part of the culture. And that, in fact, was our alternate culture. Now, after the 6th grade, I did not go on in the public school system. Coming from Camp Woodland, already used to and being very comfortable and happy in that culture, my parents sent me to the Elizabeth Irwin High School in Greenwich Village on Charlton Street. The Elizabeth Irwin High School, Elizabeth Irwin was an educator associated with John Dewey in the 1920s, and Dewey was originally on the board of directors of that school. But the elementary school, of which EI was the high school, was called the Little Red Schoolhouse. And it quickly became apparent that the name, which of course defined the traditional American school in the small town, the Little Red Schoolhouse, which is why they named it that, we of course called it, by its more appropriate name, the Little Red Schoolhouse for Little Reds. Because if you look through the alumni book, which came out 2 years ago, the Little Red Schoolhouse the alumni is a who's who of the American far left, from William Kunstler's kids to Bob Dylan's kids to Woody Guthrie's kids to Harry Belafonte's wife to my classmate Mary Travers to Angela Davis to Kathy Boudin in prison for life for her role in the Brinks Weather Underground. Virtually, they all went through EI. And just to read to you one quote from the big 75th anniversary book that came out 3 or 4 years ago, which I quote in my book. This is what they're bragging about in their 75th anniversary book. It reads, quote, this is a reminiscence from students printed in the book. They're obviously proud of this. In January of 1945, we voted to finish history with Russian history instead of American history. We were all left-leaning progressives and thought Russia was great and communism a noble experiment. We flirted with communism as an alternative. Another entry. We served coffee to Phelps Dodge strikers and worked hard for Henry Wallace in the 48 presidential election. Now, the book says that they worked for Henry Wallace. We worked for Henry Wallace. It occurred to me, was there actually not even anybody in that school, faculty or students, who worked for Harry Truman in 48? Did they all really? Probably not, actually. Probably they all did work for Henry Wallace. And it says, someone else go on to say, our teachers were victims of McCarthyism. They could teach nowhere but at Little Red and Elizabeth Irwin. They were blacklisted, and it goes on and on. We could have attended other schools, but we chose EI. We were the embattled ones, fighting for righteousness and the First Amendment. And of course, in effect, the school hired almost exclusively all the teachers who had either been kicked out of the city school system for refusing to testify before the House Committee on Un-American Activities, or other very clear, active, far-left or pro-communist left teachers. Almost virtually all of them were from the Communist Party milieu. And bear in mind the irony. I went to school from 1951, high school, to 1955. This is the heart of the so-called darkest era of McCarthyism, when supposedly we were told in the communist culture that America was on the verge of fascism. And here I was going to a high school run, essentially, by Communist Party teachers, all of whom were teaching there and teaching us and instilling that culture and set of ideas. In fact, one of the reasons why I moved very dogmatically to the worst kind of, as you said in the introduction, far-left position was because of what I've learned in high school in a very impressionable age. The high school, my history teacher, who I loved and who led me to decide to become professionally a historian, told us that Marx had proved that history was the queen of the sciences. Those were his words. And he always taught openly about the science of dialectical materialism. I mean, even the science teacher in biology taught us Trofim Lysenko. Now, she didn't say Lysenko was right, But she said there is this alternate theory, and you have to learn Lysenko. I remember this little red book we got of Lysenko's writings that were passed out. I mean, this is incredible. This is in high school during the McCarthy years, when supposedly, if there really was fascism in America, this school, of course, would have been closed down. Now, of course, they said, the student says righteousness and First Amendment. We did have one student who was, there were actually two dissidents there, I remember. One student who was a nephew of the crazed psychiatrist, famous German emigre Wilhelm Reich. He was a nephew of Wilhelm Reich, and he believed in the orgone box. You know, I don't want to get into that, but this caused great consternation in the school. Would he bring in these little model boxes and put them on his head? And that was upsetting to the school. We had one other dissident. There managed to be one kid, Bob Burke was his name, who called himself a Trotskyist. Now this, of course, Bob Burke was anathema. And he finally left the school. And I wonder what happened. A couple of months later, I remember going to some event or concert, and there was Bob Burke handing out the Militant, the Trotskyist paper. I said, what happened? I didn't see you. He said, well, I left. I couldn't be in the school with all the teachers, Stalinists. Bob Burke suffered. I mean, he was on the left, but he was a Trotskyist, not a communist. He felt he wasn't at home there. Very ironically, 20, 30 years later, I was talking at a panel discussion in the mid-1970s with Irving Howe on American socialism. And there I see this kid I knew, Bob Burke, sitting in the audience in a cleric's outfit. Bob Burke I knew to have been Jewish, and I got confused. I went up to him afterwards, and I said, how are you? I haven't seen you in 30 years or so. I'm just curious about your clothing. He said, well, I converted to Christianity. I became a Baptist. I went to divinity school, and I'm an ordained minister. And then he paused and said in a totally straight face, in religion, I'm a Christian, but in politics, I'm still a Bolshevik. So you can chalk one up for old EI. Now, one other incident. I mean, there's a lot of this in that really epitomizes my high school class being very politicized and very politically conscious. Chose as our graduation speaker the great Negro scholar and perhaps one of the greatest figures now, the subject of the Pulitzer Prize-winning David Levering Lewis biography, W.E.B. Du Bois. We chose him as our graduation speaker in 1955. And we picked Du Bois not because the souls of black folk, not because of his role as one of the greatest figures in Negro culture and history. We picked him because, in addition, we knew he was pro-communist and was a great defender of the Soviet Union and Stalin. But that's what he was known for then, if you read his stuff. I mean, and, he was like Paul Robeson. The two great Negroes were, for us, Robeson and Du Bois. Now, this caused an uproar. This got to be too much for school because there were a lot of liberal parents who sent their kids there, and they were aghast. Max Lerner, a famous anti-communist journalist, sent his daughter there. And parents like that raised an uproar. They said, we're not going to come to our kids' graduation if you let Du Bois speak there. Du Bois is anti-American, and we were told point blank that this caused a great crisis to the school. You can't have W.E.B. Du Bois speak. Randolph Smith, the principal, came in and explained to us, I know it's the first time this ever happened where the graduating class can't pick its own speaker, but these parents will pull the school could go down. Because he himself had been subpoenaed to appear before a HUAC. He said, parents will pull out who are opposed to Du Bois. We're going to work out a compromise. Du Bois will speak at an all-compulsory school assembly, and he will not, but he cannot speak at the graduation. So he did come, and I don't have much memory of what he said in the speech, except I remember it being very dull. But in his place, we got Arthur Miller. Of course, from his recent travesty at the Jefferson Lecture. Now, Arthur Miller came, and his big message to us in his graduating speech was never accept compromise, never accept half a loaf. And we thought this was the great message Arthur Miller was giving, never accept half a loaf. He was baiting the school for forcing us to give in and have him instead of Du Bois. Then, of course, 3 weeks later, we saw the headlines, Miller leaves wife for Marilyn Monroe, so we knew what he was really talking about. Now, so that's, I'm leaving a lot out. I mean, Pete Seeger, who was, of course, very involved with the school. I started taking banjo lessons from Pete Seeger, became very part of it. I won't get into that. I was very close friends with Mary Travers from Peter, Paul, and Mary, who was in my class. And just one more word about EI. I'm part of the trinity of the three great black sheep of Elizabeth Irwin High School. Aside from myself, the other two members of the trinity are Elliot Abrams and Abby Thernstrom. We too are graduates. So 3 out of I don't know how many graduates. It's quite amazing, but at least I'm not alone. Now, I'm skipping